I was standing beside the only rosebush my wife had ever forbidden me to remove, when a woman I had never seen before pushed open my garden gate, looked at the white blossoms, and whispered, "They've finally bloomed again. Eleanor said you'd still be watering them." Every instinct I'd sharpened during 26 years as a Marine combat engineer told me something was wrong. My wife had been gone for 7 months. She had never once mentioned this woman, yet somehow the stranger spoke my wife's name with the quiet certainty of someone returning to an old promise instead of a stranger's yard. One simple question settled heavily in my chest before either of us spoke again. What had Eleanor trusted this woman with that she had never trusted me to know? If you've ever honored someone's final wish without understanding why, stay with me a little longer. I kept the garden exactly as Eleanor had left it. The vegetable beds had grown wild after her funeral, and I finally admitted I wasn't much of a gardener without her gentle instructions. But the single white rosebush beside the old cedar fence never missed a morning. On the afternoon before she died, Eleanor squeezed my hand with surprising strength and made me promise only one thing. "Frank," she'd whispered, "whatever happens, don't ever stop watering that rosebush." I smiled back then, because it sounded like something only Eleanor would say. I thought grief had simply tangled itself with ordinary worries. I hadn't asked why. Now I wished I had. The woman standing beyond the gate appeared to be in her early 50s. Wind tugged softly at her gray sweater while she kept both hands folded around a worn leather satchel. She didn't look frightened. She looked relieved. "I'm sorry to arrive unannounced," she said quietly. "My name is Margaret Ellis." I nodded but didn't invite her farther inside. "I'm Frank Doyle." "I know." The answer wasn't threatening. It was gentle. That somehow unsettled me even more. She looked toward the rosebush instead of me. "Eleanor told me I should come back only after the roses bloomed again." "She told you that?" "Many years ago." I searched her face for any trace of deception. Marine service teaches you that people often reveal themselves before they realize they're speaking. Margaret didn't avoid my eyes. She didn't rush her answers. She simply waited, as though she understood that grief had already filled every silence between us. My neighbors often said Eleanor collected friendships the way other people collected family recipes. Yet I had never heard this woman's name. Not once. Margaret reached carefully into her satchel, but paused before removing anything. "I brought something Eleanor asked me to return." My heartbeat slowed. Not because I felt safer. Because I suddenly realized my wife hadn't expected this meeting to surprise Margaret. She had expected it to surprise me. Before I could ask another question, a dark pickup truck rolled slowly past the house. The driver looked toward the rose garden much longer than anyone admiring flowers normally would. Margaret noticed it too. Her expression changed for the first time since she'd arrived. She lowered her voice until it was barely more than a whisper. "We don't have as much time as Eleanor hoped." The pickup disappeared around the corner before either of us managed to read the license plate. I stood quietly beside the rosebush, listening to the fading engine, while Margaret kept her eyes fixed on the empty street. She wasn't behaving like someone afraid of being followed. She looked like someone disappointed that something inevitable had arrived sooner than expected. "Would you come inside?" I finally asked. She nodded without hesitation. Eleanor had always believed coffee made difficult conversations easier, so I filled 2 mugs before either of us sat down at the kitchen table. The room still looked almost exactly as she'd left it. Her favorite blue ceramic bowl rested beside the window. A half-finished quilt remained folded over the dining chair. Some mornings I still caught myself expecting to hear her humming while she measured flour for homemade biscuits. Margaret noticed everything. "You've kept the house the same. I haven't been ready to change it. Eleanor knew you wouldn't." That answer settled somewhere deep inside me. "You knew my wife well." A gentle smile crossed her face. "I knew the parts of Eleanor that existed long before she met you." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Margaret reached into her satchel and carefully removed an old black-and-white photograph. Two young women stood beneath the same white rosebush growing beside my cedar fence. One was unmistakably Eleanor. The other was Margaret, perhaps 18 or 19 years old. Both were laughing. Neither looked toward the camera. I turned the photograph over. In Eleanor's handwriting were only 7 words. "When the roses bloom again, come home." I stared at the sentence for a long time. Why would Eleanor write this? Because she believed promises should wait until people were ready to carry them. I frowned. "I don't understand." "I know." And she expected that. Margaret folded her hands around her coffee mug before continuing. 40 years ago, your wife saved my life." I looked up immediately. Eleanor never mentioned anything like that. She wouldn't. She always believed gratitude belonged in private. Those words sounded painfully familiar. That was exactly how Eleanor had lived. Not quietly, because she lacked courage. Quietly, because she believed kindness lost something when it demanded witnesses. Before I could ask another question, someone knocked firmly at the front door. The man waiting outside introduced himself as Nathan Briggs. He wore polished work boots, a pressed button-down shirt, and the confident smile of someone used to hearing yes. "I'm representing Willow Creek Development. I wanted to see whether you've reconsidered selling your property. I thought I made my answer clear last month." "You did. But spring permits expire soon. This neighborhood is changing quickly." His eyes drifted past me toward the garden. Then they paused on Margaret. For just an instant. Long enough to recognize her. Short enough to pretend he hadn't. He smiled again. "If you change your mind, my offer remains on the table." As he walked back toward his truck, Margaret quietly set the photograph beside Eleanor's favorite blue bowl. Then she spoke so softly I almost missed it. Eleanor hoped he would never discover what the roses were protecting. That evening I walked Nathan Briggs to the edge of my porch, with the same polite smile I'd used during years of negotiating construction contracts after leaving the Marines. "I'll think about your offer," I told him. His shoulders relaxed almost immediately. "I appreciate that, Frank. It isn't an easy decision. No. But sometimes holding on to the past costs more than letting it go." I nodded as though his words had landed exactly where he intended. When his truck disappeared down the road, Margaret looked at me with quiet disappointment. "You don't mean to sell, do you?" "No." "Then why tell him you're considering it?" I looked toward the rosebush. "Because people stop hiding things once they think they've already won." She studied my face for a long moment before smiling. "Eleanor said you'd eventually answer questions like a Marine instead of a carpenter." I laughed for the first time in months. She really said that? Many times. For the next hour, Margaret showed me old photographs, holiday cards, and letters Eleanor had written over nearly 4 decades. None of them explained why the Rosebush mattered, but every page revealed a friendship that had quietly survived marriages, illnesses, children, and distance. One sentence appeared again and again. The garden remembers better than people do. By sunset, Margaret prepared to leave. Before reaching her car, she stopped beside the white roses. There should be a stone. A stone? Small. Flat. Buried near the roots. I've never seen one. You weren't supposed to. Those words lingered in my mind long after she'd driven away. The following morning, I carried a watering can into the garden exactly as I always had. Only this time I wasn't looking at flowers. I was studying the ground. Combat engineering teaches patience before action. You don't begin digging because someone suggests something might be there. You look for disturbances, settling, repairs, and patterns. The soil around the rosebush looked ordinary. Until I noticed one small difference. 3 old landscape bricks formed a rough triangle beneath the mulch. Unlike the others lining the flowerbed, these had been turned upside down years earlier. Deliberately. Someone had wanted them overlooked. I knelt carefully and brushed away loose bark with my gloved hand. Less than an inch below the surface, my fingers touched smooth granite, not large, perhaps 8 inches across. No inscription appeared on top. Only a tiny carved rose. My heartbeat quickened. Before I could lift it, tires crunched slowly across the gravel driveway. Nathan Briggs again. He climbed from his truck, carrying a clipboard and an apologetic smile. Sorry to bother you. I was nearby. I realized I forgot to mention something. I stood, wiping dirt from my hands before he could notice the disturbed mulch. What is it? Our survey crew may need temporary access to neighboring lots next week. They won't disturb your garden. His reassurance arrived too quickly. He hadn't even seen what I was doing. That alone told me he was already thinking about the flowerbed. I'll let you know, I answered. He glanced once toward the white roses, then toward the cedar fence, then back at me. Exactly the same sequence. Not admiration, orientation, as though confirming something he'd memorized years earlier. After he finally drove away, I returned to the granite marker. Carefully lifting one edge, I discovered not a buried box, but the corner of an oilcloth package sealed tightly against moisture. For 7 months, I believed I had been keeping a promise by watering one rosebush. Now I realized Eleanor had quietly asked me to guard something hidden beneath it all along. My hands were steady as I lifted the oilcloth package from beneath the granite marker. Years of building homes had taught me something that started long before my years in the Marines. Wood, stone, and earth all remember the people who shaped them. Whoever buried this package hadn't been in a hurry. The hole had been lined with gravel for drainage. The oilcloth had been folded 3 times before being sealed with wax. Eleanor hadn't hidden something. She had preserved it. I carried the package into my workshop instead of the house. Dust floated through the afternoon light, while familiar tools hung quietly above my old workbench. Eleanor always joked that if she couldn't find me, she only had to listen for the sound of sandpaper. The wax seal cracked with surprising ease. Inside rested 3 leather-bound journals wrapped in linen. Beneath them lay a brass key tied to a faded white ribbon. No money, no jewelry, no legal papers, only journals. The first page was written in Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting. If Frank is reading this, then the roses have bloomed again. Margaret kept her promise, and I have finally trusted time to explain what I never could. I had to stop reading. Not because the words were difficult, because I could hear Eleanor's voice saying every one of them. The first journal didn't begin with secrets. It began with friendship. 42 years earlier, Eleanor had met Margaret at a volunteer woodworking class held for widows rebuilding their lives after a devastating factory closure. They had become inseparable. Then, one winter, my small carpentry business nearly collapsed. Orders disappeared. Medical bills arrived after our son's accident. Our mortgage fell months behind. I remembered those years. I remembered believing we survived through extra work and impossible luck. The journals revealed something very different. Margaret had quietly sold a piece of inherited farmland without telling anyone. The proceeds had been funneled through anonymous church donations and community assistance programs until our debts disappeared one payment at a time. Eleanor discovered the truth only years later. She tried to repay every dollar. Margaret refused. Instead, the two women made another promise. If the roses ever bloom after one of us is gone, the other must finally let the truth live. I closed the journal slowly. For 40 years, I had thanked God for unexpected blessings. I had never known whose sacrifice helped deliver them. A folded property survey slipped from between the second and third journals. At first it looked ordinary. Then I noticed several handwritten notes in the margins. Not Eleanor's handwriting. Someone else's. Several neighboring homes were marked with red circles. Each circle included one name. Each name belonged to elderly families still living on our street. One final note appeared beside my own property. Complete acquisition only after Rose lot transfers. My stomach tightened. The rose garden wasn't valuable because flowers grew there. It was the final parcel preventing several adjoining properties from becoming one continuous development site. Eleanor hadn't protected the garden because of sentiment alone. She had protected the last piece that kept an entire block of elderly homeowners from being quietly forced out through coordinated purchases. The journals had changed everything. This was no longer only a story about gratitude between two lifelong friends. It had become evidence. Just then, Margaret hurried into the workshop without knocking. Her breathing was uneven. "They've started surveying the empty lots." "Already?" She nodded. "And Frank?" She looked directly at the journals resting on my bench. "I think Carl Whitmore knows you've found them." I frowned. "The property trustee?" "I saw him speaking privately with Nathan Briggs. He pointed toward your garden." Until that moment, I'd believed Nathan Briggs was leading the pressure campaign. Now another name had quietly stepped into the center of the story. And somehow, I already suspected he had been there much longer than any of us realized. Margaret locked the workshop door behind her before either of us spoke again. I spread the journals, the property survey, and the brass key across my old workbench, arranging them the way I used to lay out bridge components before a construction project overseas. When emotions begin clouding judgment, organization becomes its own form of discipline. "Carl Whitmore has been the neighborhood trustee for almost 15 years, I said. "Everyone trusts him." "That's exactly why Eleanor worried," Margaret replied. She opened the second journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon. Eleanor had written about attending a community planning meeting nearly 12 years earlier. Most of the entry described ordinary conversations, but one paragraph had been underlined twice. "Carl never lies completely. He simply tells people the smallest truth while hiding the larger one. That sentence sounded less like a diary entry and more like a warning. We continued reading together. Page after page revealed Eleanor's quiet observations. Elderly homeowners had accepted generous offers to sell after believing they were the last people resisting redevelopment. In reality, Carl had approached each family separately, convincing every one of them that everyone else had already agreed. Several neighbors left peacefully because they thought they were inconveniencing the community by staying. The signatures were legal. The decisions were voluntary. The manipulation was hidden. Then Margaret unfolded another sheet tucked inside the journal. It wasn't a deed. It was a handwritten ledger. Each entry listed anonymous church donations made over 20 years. Beside every amount appeared a family name from our neighborhood. Eleanor and Margaret hadn't used those donations only to help my family. They quietly assisted widows with heating bills, covered prescription costs for veterans, and helped struggling homeowners pay overdue property taxes. Keeping those families financially stable prevented distressed sales that would have allowed developers to buy the entire block much sooner. I leaned back in my chair. The garden was never the real protection. Margaret nodded. The people were. That realization struck harder than anything I'd read all afternoon. I had spent months believing the Rosebush itself mattered most. Instead, it had become the symbol Eleanor used to guard something far larger. A community held together by quiet acts of generosity no one was ever meant to notice. A loud knock interrupted us. This time it wasn't Nathan Briggs. Carl Whitmore stood outside with a warm smile and a neatly wrapped casserole dish. "I heard Margaret was visiting," he said pleasantly. "Thought I'd check on both of you." Everything about him looked sincere. His voice, his posture, even the sympathy in his eyes. Had I met him yesterday, I would have invited him straight inside. Instead, I stepped onto the porch and closed the screen door behind me. "That's thoughtful of you. I know these months have been difficult." "They have." He glanced toward the workshop for only a heartbeat. "Still spending time with your woodworking?" "When I can." "I always admired Eleanor's rose garden. So did she." He smiled again. "If you decide to accept Nathan's offer, I can help make the paperwork easy." There it was. Not pressure. Convenience. Exactly the kind of practical language Eleanor had warned me about. After he left, I carried the casserole into the kitchen without touching the journals again. If Carl suspected we had already uncovered the truth, he would become more careful. We needed him confident, comfortable, and convinced I was still nothing more than an aging widower overwhelmed by memories. Sometimes winning doesn't begin by exposing what you know. Sometimes it begins by convincing the other person you know almost nothing. As I returned to the workshop, my eyes fell on the brass key tied with the faded white ribbon. For the first time, I noticed 3 tiny numbers stamped near its base. 317. Whatever door that key opened, Eleanor had believed it mattered enough to bury beside 40 years of truth. That evening I slipped the brass key into my pocket, covered the journals with an old canvas tarp, and returned the granite marker exactly where I'd found it. If Carl Whitmore or anyone else came looking, I wanted the rosebush to appear untouched. Marines are taught that the strongest defensive position is often the one your opponent never realizes exists. Eleanor had hidden the truth for 40 years. My job now was to protect it for a few days longer. Margaret watched quietly as I swept away every trace of disturbed soil. "You've done this before," she said. "I've hidden bridge supports under floodwater." She smiled faintly. "I suppose a flowerbed isn't much different. Only the stakes are." The next morning, we drove to the old First Community Church, carrying only the brass key and the second journal. Eleanor had written one short instruction beside the number 317. "When the roses bloom again, trust Pastor Henry." Pastor Henry had retired years earlier, but the church secretary remembered him immediately. "His old office downstairs is still locked," she said. "Storage room 317. We never changed the number." The brass key fit perfectly. Inside waited a narrow room filled with dusty filing cabinets, unused hymnals, and faded holiday decorations. At first it looked disappointingly ordinary. Then Margaret noticed a small cedar box tucked behind an old shelf. The same tiny carved rose decorated its lid. Inside rested a bundle of sealed envelopes, several cassette tapes, and a notarized letter addressed to the Willow Creek Historical Society. Beneath them lay copies of property maps identical to the ones in Eleanor's journals, except these included signatures from former trustees and handwritten meeting notes documenting how vulnerable homeowners had been approached separately to encourage quick sales. Eleanor hadn't collected rumors. She had preserved a pattern. Track A had just become Track B. The journals explained the story. These documents could prove it. As we carried the box back to my truck, Margaret stopped walking. Across the parking lot stood Nathan Briggs speaking with Carl Whitmore. Neither man approached us. Neither waved. Carl simply looked at the cedar box for a fraction of a second before turning away. "He knows," Margaret whispered. "I think he knows we found something." "Not everything," I answered. "And that's the difference." Back home, I called the director of the Willow Creek Historical Society, an old customer named Linda Chavez. Years earlier, I'd built display cabinets for their museum. Without explaining the entire story, I asked one question. If someone wanted to preserve original journals and historical land records before they disappeared, could your archive authenticate and protect them? Her answer came without hesitation. Absolutely. Within 2 hours, the journals had been photographed, scanned, cataloged, and placed inside the Society's fireproof archive. Certified copies were prepared under documented chain of custody. The originals would remain protected. The copies would be enough if someone tried to destroy the evidence. Driving home, I felt strangely lighter, not because we had won, because Eleanor's truth no longer depended on a single flowerbed. Late that afternoon, my phone rang. Carl Whitmore. "Frank," he said warmly, "Nathan tells me you're still undecided." "I am. I'd hate to see you miss such a generous offer." I looked through the kitchen window toward the white roses. "Maybe you're right. I've been thinking." A brief silence followed. Then I gave him exactly what he hoped to hear. "I believe it's finally time to let the property go." His relief was almost audible. When the call ended, Margaret stared at me. "You just handed him the victory." I slowly shook my head. "No. I handed him confidence." Sometimes the most important question isn't whether the truth will survive. It's whether the people hiding from it believe they're already safe enough to stop pretending. 3 days later, I sat across from Carl Whitmore in the conference room of Willow Creek Development, with a purchase agreement resting between us. Nathan Briggs poured fresh coffee, smiled politely, and slid a pen across the polished table. I think Eleanor would want you to enjoy retirement without worrying about an old house, Nathan said. I looked down at the contract. I've spent enough years fixing things. Maybe it's time someone else took over. I gave a slow nod. Maybe it is. Neither man realized that every word they spoke was being recorded as part of the public meeting scheduled to begin in 15 minutes. State law required the development board to document final acquisition discussions before approving the neighborhood project. Carl had insisted on handling everything himself. Confidence makes people careless. Eleanor had written that sentence in her second journal. She was right. Residents slowly filled the adjoining community hall. Some were widows whose names appeared in Eleanor's donation ledger. Others had sold their homes years earlier, after believing they had no real choice. Margaret quietly took a seat beside Linda Chavez from the Historical Society. On the front table rested a sealed archival box containing certified copies of the journals and authenticated property records. The originals never left the archive. Carl didn't know that. When the meeting officially began, Nathan presented colorful drawings of future townhomes, walking trails, and attractive storefronts. The proposal sounded reasonable. It almost always had. Then Carl stood. For years, he announced, we've worked carefully to respect every homeowner's wishes. Several people nodded. I almost did myself. He continued. No resident has ever been pressured. Every sale has been voluntary. That was my moment. I rose slowly. I'm Frank Doyle. I've lived on Rose Lane for 43 years. I have a few questions before I sign anything. Nathan smiled confidently. Of course. I opened Eleanor's first journal. My late wife wrote that neighbors were repeatedly told they were the last families refusing to sell. Carl answered immediately. People often remember conversations differently. I agree. I lifted the authenticated property maps. Then perhaps documents remember more accurately. The room grew noticeably quieter. Linda Chavez stood and handed copies to each planning board member. Every map carried notarized certification from the Historical Society. Carl's smile faded. Nathan looked at him for the first time that afternoon. I continued. These journals also contain donation records proving several struggling homeowners avoided financial distress, only because anonymous community assistance kept them from being forced into premature sales. Margaret quietly stepped forward. My name is Margaret Ellis. For 40 years, Eleanor Doyle and I protected these records. Carl interrupted. Those journals prove nothing. They're personal writings. He sounded stronger now, almost convincing. Then Linda placed another envelope on the table. The accompanying trustee meeting notes, she said calmly, were recovered from church storage, authenticated, and matched against county archives. Board members opened the copies. Silence spread through the room. One member adjusted his glasses. Another compared dates. Everything matched. Carl's composure cracked for the first time. Those notes are incomplete. They lack context. They show context, I answered quietly. They show families being approached separately while each was told everyone else had already agreed. Nathan slowly turned toward Carl. You never mentioned these records. Carl didn't answer. Instead, he reached toward the journals. Not violently, desperately. But before his hand touched the table, Linda closed the archival box. Those are certified copies. The originals are permanently preserved. For the first time all afternoon, Carl understood. Destroying these papers would accomplish nothing. The truth no longer depended on one rosebush, or one journal, or one grieving husband. It now belonged to history itself. The planning board chair quietly folded the purchase agreement. I believe this meeting requires immediate suspension. Outside the hall, reporters were already gathering after receiving anonymous copies of the public agenda earlier that morning. Nathan removed his company badge and placed it silently on the table. I was never told how this project began. Carl finally lowered his head, not because someone had defeated him with anger, but because years of carefully arranged half-truths had collapsed beneath simple evidence patiently preserved by two ordinary women who never expected recognition. Eleanor had spent decades protecting her neighbors. That afternoon, her voice finally reached all of them. Several months passed before the first truly warm morning of summer. By then, the development project had been suspended indefinitely, while county investigators reviewed decades of property records. Carl Whitmore quietly resigned as trustee. Nathan Briggs publicly admitted he had relied on incomplete information and withdrew his company's proposal for our neighborhood. Justice hadn't arrived with handcuffs or angry speeches. It arrived the way Eleanor probably would have preferred, through patient evidence, honest records, and ordinary people finally seeing the whole truth. Margaret visited every Saturday after that. Sometimes we talked about Eleanor. Sometimes we simply worked in the garden together without saying much at all. One afternoon, she handed me the last unopened envelope from the cedar box. Inside was a single handwritten note. Frank, if you're reading this, then you finally know why I asked you to water only one rosebush. Flowers don't protect memories. People do. The roses were only there to remind us where love quietly waited until someone was ready to carry it forward. I read the note twice before folding it carefully into my shirt pocket. A few weeks later, Linda Chavez and the Historical Society dedicated a small, permanent exhibit honoring the neighborhood's history. The journals, preserved safely in climate-controlled archives, became part of the official community record. Copies of Eleanor's writings reminded visitors that kindness rarely announces itself while it is happening, yet its roots can hold an entire neighborhood together for generations. The only thing I donated was the story. The rose garden stayed exactly where it belonged. Two simple cedar benches now face the white blossoms beneath the old fence. One bears Eleanor's name, the other bears Margaret's. Every spring, children stop to smell the roses without realizing why those flowers still bloom there. Somehow, that feels exactly right. Before I water them each morning, I still touch the smooth granite marker hidden beneath the soil. Not because I'm guarding another secret, but because it reminds me that the greatest promises are often the quiet ones we keep long after the people we love are gone. If this story reminded you that small acts of faithfulness can shape lives in ways we may never fully see, I hope you'll carry that thought into someone else's day. And wherever life finds you, may your home be filled with peace, your heart strengthened by truth, and your own quiet acts of kindness bloom for generations to come.